I stood there in our little kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the air as I poured water into the machine. It was a Monday, the start of Thanksgiving week, and everything felt normal until Julia opened her mouth. "Mom insisted you come to the family dinner this year," she said, her voice light, like she was talking about the weather. I froze, my hand still on the coffee pot. Insisted? Lorraine, her mother, had never wanted me around. I could still hear her voice from years ago, sharp and cold, calling me too blue-collar for her taste. Julia didn't even look up from her phone as she said it, like she assumed I'd just nod and go along. We'd been fighting more lately, little arguments that always seemed to circle back to her family. I didn't want to go, didn't want to sit in that fancy house with people who looked at me like I was dirt on their shoes. But then I thought about Zoe, our daughter, who was off with her friend's family for the holiday. I thought about how Julia's eyes softened when I tried to keep the peace. So I swallowed the bitterness in my throat and said, "Fine, I'll go." She smiled, quick and easy, like that settled it. I turned back to the coffee, watching it drip into the pot, dark and steady. My stomach twisted a little, a warning I didn't listen to. I figured it'd be a few hours of awkward small talk, maybe a couple of Lorraine's snide comments, and then we'd be back home. What else could I do? I'd been playing this game for years, smiling through the jabs, keeping my mouth shut for Julia's sake. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured myself a mug, the steam rising up to my face. I took a sip, burning my tongue just a little. It was a small house, ours, nothing like Lorraine's place, but it was ours. Julia was already talking about what she'd wear, her voice drifting over me as I stared out the window at the gray November sky. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. She'd made up her mind, and I'd agreed. That's how it worked. I thought about calling in sick or making up some excuse, maybe the car breaking down, but Julia would see right through it. She always did. I rubbed my hand over my face, feeling the stubble I hadn't bothered to shave. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, right? Gratitude and all that. But with Lorraine, it always felt like a test, one I never passed. I glanced at Julia, her dark hair pulled back, her fingers tapping away at her phone. She looked happy, excited even. I didn't want to ruin that. So I kept my mouth shut, took another sip of coffee, and told myself it'd be fine. One night. I could handle one night. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, counting down the hours until we'd leave. I didn't know it then, but that dinner was going to be more than just uncomfortable. It was going to change everything. I set the mug down on the counter, the ceramic clinking against the wood. "What time do we need to be there?" I asked, my voice flat. Julia didn't notice. "5," she said, still smiling. "5. Plenty of time to brace myself." I nodded, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside for some air. The cold hit me fast, waking me up. I stood on the porch, hands in my pockets, staring at the bare trees lining our street. I could do this. For Julia, I could do this. That's what I told myself, anyway. The coffee sat untouched behind me, getting cold. I didn't go back for it. Something told me I'd need more than caffeine to get through what was coming. We pulled up to Lorraine's big house just as the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the perfectly trimmed lawn. I turned off the engine, and the car went quiet, but I could already hear the chatter spilling out from inside. Julia smoothed her hair in the visor mirror, looking calm, like this was just another family get-together. For her, maybe it was. For me, it felt like walking into a lion's den with a sign around my neck that said, "Easy Target." Lorraine's place was all luxury, white columns, huge windows, a driveway that could fit half our neighborhood. I grabbed the bottle of wine we'd brought, some cheap red Julia insisted was fine, and stepped out into the chilly air. My boots crunched on the gravel as we walked up to the door. Julia didn't knock. She just pushed it open, and the noise hit me like a wave. Her older sister, Monica, was there with her husband, Trevor, and their 2 kids, who were already running around chasing each other. The smell of food, turkey, spices, something sweet, hung heavy in the air, mixing with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Lorraine swept in from the living room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Hair perfect, dress expensive, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She threw her arms around Julia first, then Monica, planting those fake little air kisses on their cheeks. "My girls," she said, her voice all syrupy. Then her gaze landed on me. Her lips twitched, barely a nod, like I was the delivery guy dropping off a package. Marcus, she said, flat, no warmth. I held up the wine bottle, forcing a grin. Brought something for the table. She glanced at it, then back at me, and didn't say a word. Julia didn't notice, or didn't care. She was already pulling off her coat, chatting with Monica about some cousin I'd never met. I stood there, feeling the weight of the room shift around me. The relatives were all there. Uncles, aunts, a few people I didn't even recognize, sprawled across the fancy couches, sipping drinks. Trevor gave me a quick handshake, his grip weak, his eyes darting away like he didn't want to be caught talking to me too long. The kids ran past, yelling about some game, and I stepped aside to let them through. Lorraine clapped her hands, getting everyone's attention. "Dinner's almost ready," she announced. Then her eyes flicked to me again. "Oh, Marcus, you came. Bold of you to assume you'd be welcome." She said it with a little laugh, like it was a joke, and the room chuckled along, polite, practiced. My jaw tightened, but I smiled anyway. What else could I do? Call her out? Make a scene? Nah, that wasn't me. I'd learned a long time ago that smiling through it was easier than fighting. Julia didn't even blink, just kept talking to Monica, her voice bright and unbothered. I shoved my hands in my pockets, feeling the cold metal of my keys against my fingers. The house was warm, too warm, and I could feel sweat starting to prick at the back of my neck. Lorraine turned away, her attention back on her daughters, praising Monica's new haircut, asking Julia about work. I was invisible again, just how she liked it. Trevor hovered nearby, sipping a beer, looking like he wanted to say something but didn't. The kids darted around, their shoes squeaking on the floor, and I wondered how long I'd have to stand there before someone noticed I wasn't part of this. I glanced at the big windows, the ones that looked out over the backyard where Lorraine had a pool nobody used this time of year. Everything here was for show, the house, the furniture, even the people. I shifted my weight, the wine bottle still in my hand, and Monica finally looked my way. "Oh, you can put that in the kitchen," she said, waving a hand like I was the help. I nodded, still smiling, and headed that way, weaving through the crowd. The kitchen was huge, all stainless steel and marble, with trays of food lined up on the counter. I set the bottle down next to a stack of fancy cheeses and took a breath. The chatter from the living room drifted in, loud and cheerful, but it felt miles away. I leaned against the counter for a second, staring at the floor. This was just the start. I could feel it. Lorraine had her first shot in, and there'd be more. I straightened up, brushed my hands on my jeans, and walked back out. Julia caught my eye for a split second, then looked away, laughing at something Monica said. I smiled again. It was going to be a long night. The house was alive with the smells of Thanksgiving, roasted turkey, candied yams, cranberry sauce, all of it mixing together in a way that should have felt comforting. I followed Julia and the rest of the crowd into the dining room, my stomach growling despite the knot tightening in my chest. The table was a sight, long and polished, set with fancy plates and silverware that probably cost more than my truck. Candles flickered in the center, casting a warm glow over the spread of food waiting to be carved up. Everyone was moving, finding their spots, voices overlapping as they complimented Lorraine on the setup. I hung back a little, letting Julia go ahead, figuring I'd just slide into whatever seat was left. That's when Lorraine's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. "Marcus, your seat's right there," she said, pointing not at the big table, but at a wobbly little folding thing shoved up against the wall, right by the kitchen trash bin. I stopped dead, my boots heavy on the floor. The main table had 12 chairs, and I could see 2 of them still empty, their cushions untouched. But Lorraine's face had that smirk, the one she saved just for me, and she added, "Be grateful we even gave you a seat." The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then Monica let out a little giggle, like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all day. Julia didn't say a word, just kept adjusting her napkin, her eyes on her plate. Trevor shifted in his chair, looking down at his hands, his face tight but silent. I felt the heat creeping up my neck, but I didn't argue. What was the point? I walked over to the side table, the legs creaking as I pulled out the rickety chair. It wobbled when I sat down, the edge digging into my back. I could smell the trash bin from here, old coffee grounds and something sour. The big table was only a few feet away, but it might as well have been across the state. Everyone started passing dishes around, the clatter of spoons and forks filling the air. Lorraine stood at the head, carving the turkey with a flourish, smiling like she was on some cooking show. "Julia, honey, you want a drumstick?" she asked, her voice all sugar. Julia nodded, and Monica piped up for some breast meat. Me? I just sat there, hands in my lap, watching the food go around. Nobody looked my way. The kids, Monica's boys, were arguing over who got the bigger roll, their voices loud and whining. Trevor muttered something to them, trying to keep them in line, but his eyes flicked to me for a second, then away again. I could tell he felt bad, but not bad enough to do anything. The table I was at had nothing on it. No plates, no food, just a scratched-up surface and a view of everyone else eating. I shifted in the chair, trying to get comfortable, but it rocked under me, unsteady as my mood. I thought about saying something, maybe a joke to break the tension, but the words stuck in my throat. Lorraine was in her element, directing the meal like a queen, and I was the outsider she'd put in his place. Julia laughed at something Monica said, her head tilted back, and I watched her, waiting for her to look at me. She didn't. Not once. The food kept moving, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans with almonds, stuffing that smelled like sage and butter. My mouth watered, but I kept my face blank. I'd been hungry when we walked in, but now it was something else churning in my gut. Lorraine finally sat down, her plate piled high, and raised her glass. "To family," she said, her eyes skipping right over me. The others lifted their glasses, murmuring agreement, and the meal started in earnest. I leaned back, the chair squeaking, and crossed my arms. A minute later, one of Lorraine's cousins, a guy with a loud voice and a red tie, wandered over with a plate in his hand. "Oh, you're over here, huh?" he said, like it was a surprise. He didn't offer me anything, just stood there chewing, then walked off. I stared at the wall, the faded wallpaper curling at the edges. The trash bin smelled stronger now, or maybe I was just noticing it more. I could hear the kids laughing, the adults talking about work and vacations, all of it normal, like I wasn't even there. My hands clenched into fists under the table, but I kept my smile on, small and tight. This was it then. My spot. My welcome. I glanced at Julia again, her fork moving to her mouth, her face relaxed. She didn't see me. Nobody did. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just a bad seat. This was a message. The clinking of forks and glasses filled the dining room as everyone dug into their food, the warm glow of the candles bouncing off the fancy plates. I sat there at my little wobbly table, the trash bin humming quietly beside me with its sour smell. The big table was alive. Laughter, chatter, the sound of Lorraine's voice cutting through it all as she passed around more gravy. My plate showed up late, after everyone else had already started eating. Monica's oldest kid, a skinny boy with messy hair, shuffled over and dropped it in front of me like it was a chore. 2 scoops of mashed potatoes, cold and lumpy, sat there next to a sad little pile of green beans. No turkey, no gravy, nothing warm. I stared at it, my stomach turning, not from hunger anymore, but from something heavier. I picked up the fork, the metal cool in my hand, and poked at the potatoes. They stuck to the tines, gluey and stiff. The green beans were limp, like they'd been sitting out too long. I forced a bite down, chewing slow, tasting nothing but the bitterness creeping up from my chest. Across the room, Julia was smiling, her plate full of golden turkey and steaming sides. She didn't look my way, not even a glance. Lorraine raised her glass again, her voice loud and bright. "To family, some of us more than others," she said, her eyes flicking toward me for just a second, that smirk tugging at her lips. The table laughed, a ripple of sound that hit me like a slap. Monica covered her mouth, pretending it was cute, while Trevor stared at his food, his jaw tight. The kids didn't notice, too busy fighting over the last roll. I swallowed another bite, the cold potatoes sticking in my throat, and set the fork down quiet on the table. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curling into my palms. I kept my face steady, lips turned up just enough to look like I was fine. Smiling was my shield. I'd been using it for years with these people. Call it habit, call it survival. But inside, my chest was burning. I could feel the weight of every eye that wasn't on me, every laugh that wasn't for me. Julia took a sip of wine, her head tilted as she listened to some story her aunt was telling. I watched her, waiting for something, anything, to show she saw what was happening. Her eyes stayed on her glass, then on Monica, then back to her plate. Nothing. Lorraine leaned over to carve more turkey, her knife slicing through the meat like it was butter, and handed a thick piece to Trevor. "You need to eat more, dear," she said, all motherly, like she cared. He mumbled a thanks, still not looking up. I pushed the green beans around my plate, the fork scraping against the cheap plastic. The food was a joke, but it wasn't about the food. It was about me, about them making sure I knew I didn't belong. The chatter went on, loud and easy, stories about old Thanksgivings, some trip Monica took last summer. I sat there, the trash bin my only company, its lid creaking every time someone walked by and bumped it. I could have stood up, could have said something, asked for a real plate, made a crack about the table, but what good would it do? They'd laugh harder, or worse, pretend I didn't exist at all. So I stayed put, took another bite, let the coldness settle in my mouth. My jaw worked slow, mechanical, like I was just going through the motions. The candles flickered, wax dripping onto the cloth at the big table. Lorraine's voice rose again, talking about tradition, about how grateful she was for her girls and their families. I wasn't in that picture, never had been. I glanced at my plate, half empty now, and felt the room shrink around me. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. I wanted to push the table away, walk out, breathe something that wasn't this. But I didn't. I stayed, fork in hand, smile locked on. Julia laughed again, her voice soft and familiar, the sound I used to love hearing at home. Now it just twisted the knife deeper. She didn't care, or didn't see. Maybe both. I set the fork down for good, the metal clinking against the plate, and leaned back in the chair. It wobbled under me, unsteady as my thoughts. The meal went on, the big table a world away, and I sat there, swallowing more than just cold food. Humiliation tastes worse than you'd think, sharp, heavy, like it's choking you slow. I kept smiling, though. Always smiling. It's what I do. The noise of the dining room buzzed around me, forks scraping plates, glasses clinking, Lorraine's voice still carrying over it all like she owned the air itself. I sat there at my shaky little table, the cold potatoes and green beans gone from my plate, though I barely remembered eating them. My hands rested on my thighs, the rough denim grounding me as I stared at the scratched-up surface in front of me. The trash bin next to me let out a faint whiff of something stale every time the kitchen door swung open. I'd had enough. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough. I pushed the chair back, the legs squeaking against the floor, and stood up. Nobody noticed. Julia was laughing at something Monica said, her head tilted back, her wine glass half empty. Trevor was cutting up food for the kids, his eyes on his plate. Lorraine was holding court, passing a dish of yams like she was doing everyone a favor. I folded my napkin, some thin, cheap thing they'd tossed my way, and set it down on the table, careful not to let it wobble too much. My boots felt heavy as I turned and walked toward the front door, the voices fading a little with each step. The hallway was dim, lined with framed photos of Julia and Monica as kids, Lorraine beaming beside them. No sign of me anywhere, not that I expected it. I grabbed my jacket from the pile on the coat rack, the familiar weight of it settling over my shoulders. That's when Lorraine's voice cut through, sharp and mocking. Running off already? We haven't finished mocking you yet. She laughed, and the room joined in, a chorus of chuckles that followed me like smoke. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and turned just enough to look at her. She stood there at the head of the table, glass in hand, that smirk plastered on her face. Julia's eyes flicked up for a second, then dropped back to her plate. Monica giggled into her napkin. Trevor shifted, uncomfortable but silent. I could have said a lot, could have let the anger boiling in my chest spill out and burn the whole room down. But I didn't. I smiled instead, small and tight, and said, "Thanks for the seat." My voice was steady, quieter than I felt. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold November air hit me hard, stinging my face, waking me up. I didn't slam the door behind me, just let it click shut, soft and final. My truck was parked where I'd left it, the gravel crunching under my boots as I walked over. I climbed in, the leather seat cold against my back, and started the engine. The rumble filled the silence, steady and low. I didn't peel out, didn't gun it down the driveway like some guy in a movie. I just drove, slow and calm, the headlights cutting through the dusk. Lorraine's big house shrank in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing like nothing had happened. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, but I kept my breathing even. The road stretched out ahead, empty and dark, and I let it pull me away. I hit the highway a few miles later, the hum of the tires against asphalt drowning out the echoes of that laugh. My phone sat in the cup holder, screen black. I reached over and turned it off, pressing the button until it went dead. No calls, no texts, just quiet. I didn't know where I was going yet, didn't care. The air in the cab was cold, seeping through my jacket, but it felt good. Clean. I rolled the window down a crack, letting the wind rush in, tugging at my hair. My mind kept replaying it. The table, the cold food, Julia's silence. I could still see her face, the way she wouldn't look at me, like I wasn't even there. My chest tightened, but I pushed it down. I wasn't going back. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The highway signs blurred past Providence, some town I'd never heard of. I didn't need a plan, didn't need anything but distance. The dashboard clock glowed green. 7:42. Dinner would still be going on, dessert probably coming out soon. Lorraine would be spinning it already, telling everyone I was too sensitive, too dramatic. Let her. I didn't know them a damn thing. The road curved, and I followed it, the truck steady under my hands. For the first time all night, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't smile this time, didn't need to. The quiet was enough. The highway stretched out dark and endless, the truck's headlights carving a path through the night as I drove away from Lorraine's house. My phone stayed off in the cup holder, a dead weight I wasn't ready to touch. I didn't know where I was headed, just kept going, the hum of the engine filling the silence I'd craved all evening. After a while, the glow of a neon sign caught my eye off Route 5, Darla's Kitchen. It was a small diner, the kind with chipped paint and a flickering open light in the window. My stomach growled, reminding me how little I'd eaten back there. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching as I parked between a beat-up sedan and a pickup older than mine. The air was cold when I stepped out, my breath puffing in little clouds as I walked to the door. Inside, it was warm, the smell of fried eggs and coffee hitting me like a welcome. The place was mostly empty, just a trucker at the counter and an old guy in a booth reading a paper. The waitress, a woman with graying hair and a name tag that said Nancy, looked up from wiping the counter. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just nodded like she'd seen guys like me before. "Seat yourself," she said, her voice rough but not unfriendly. I slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl creaking under me. The menu was sticky, laminated with faded pictures of burgers and pie. Nancy came over, coffee pot in hand. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, thanks." She poured it into a chipped mug, the steam rising up, and left me to it. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat soak into my fingers. My mind was still spinning Lorraine's smirk, Julia's silence, that damn folding table. I took a sip, the coffee strong and bitter, waking me up. Nancy came back a minute later. "You eating?" she asked. I glanced at the menu. Burger. Fries. Whatever's quick. She scribbled it down and walked off. No questions, no small talk. I like that. The window beside me showed my truck in the lot, the night pressing in around it. I pulled my phone out, just to check the time, then saw the screen light up with notifications as it powered on. 17 missed calls. Julia. Monica. Lorraine. A couple numbers I didn't know. Text piled up too. "Where are you?" From Julia. "You're overreacting," from Monica. "It was just a joke," from some cousin. Lorraine's was the best. "Don't do this to Julia." I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen. They weren't sorry, not really. They were mad I'd left, mad I'd made them look bad. Embarrassed, maybe, but not sorry. I set the phone face down on the table, the buzz of it fading as more messages rolled in. Nancy brought the food, a burger piled high with lettuce and tomato, fries crispy and hot. "Pie's on the house," she said, sliding a slice of apple next to it. "You look like you need it." I managed a half smile. "Thanks." She nodded and left me alone again. The burger was good, juicy, warm, the kind of food that fills you up without asking anything back. I ate slow, letting the noise in my head settle. The fries were salty, crunchy, better than anything I'd had in that fancy dining room. The pie was sweet, the crust flaky, and for a minute, I could almost forget the night. Almost. My phone kept vibrating, a quiet hum against the table. I flipped it over once, just to see 23 missed calls now. Julia's name flashed again, then Monica's. I didn't open the texts, didn't listen to the voicemails. What was there to say? They'd watched me sit there, humiliated, and done nothing. Now they wanted me to come back and play nice? Nah. I finished the pie, the last bite sticking to the fork, and leaned back in the booth. Nancy refilled my coffee without asking, her eyes flicking to the phone. "Rough night?" she said, not pushing. "Yeah," I answered, keeping it short. She didn't press, just topped off the mug and walked away. The coffee burned my tongue a little, but I didn't mind. The diner was quiet now, the trucker gone, the old guy folding his paper. I looked out at the lot again, my truck sitting there like it was waiting for me to figure things out. I didn't have a plan, just knew I wasn't going home. Not yet. The phone buzzed one more time. I turned it off again, the screen going black. Let them call. I wasn't answering. The diner's warmth faded behind me as I stepped back into the cold night, my breath fogging in the air. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the truck, the taste of coffee and pie still on my tongue. I didn't feel like driving home, didn't feel like facing Julia or the empty house waiting there. So I kept going, the highway stretching out under the stars, until I spotted a sign for a small inn just off the road. It was nothing fancy, wooden siding, a flickering vacancy light, a few cars parked out front. Perfect. I pulled in, grabbed my wallet, and headed inside. The lobby smelled like old carpet and pine cleaner, and the guy at the desk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me a key. Room 12. Upstairs, second door on the left. I paid in cash, no questions asked, and climbed the creaky stairs to my spot for the night. The room was simple, a bed with a thin blanket, a chair by the window, a sink in the corner. No TV, no noise, just quiet. I dropped my jacket on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under me. My hands felt heavy, resting on my knees as I stared at the faded wallpaper. The silence was loud, pressing in, and my mind wouldn't stop. Julia's face kept flashing up, how she'd sat there at Lorraine's table, laughing, not looking at me. How she'd let it all happen. Monica's kids had stared, confused but not shocked, like they'd seen this game before. Trevor, head down, cutting his turkey like it was his job to stay out of it. And Lorraine, God, Lorraine. She'd loved every second, her smirk sharp as a blade. I rubbed my face, the stubble rough against my palms, and let out a long breath. The room was cold, the heater rattling, but not doing much. I didn't care. I pulled my phone out, turned it on just to see. 42 missed calls now. Julia, mostly, but Lorraine too, and Monica, and those random numbers, probably cousins or aunts jumping in. A voicemail from Julia popped up, time-stamped an hour ago. I hesitated, my thumb over the play button, then pressed it. Her voice came through, shaky and wet with tears. Marcus, where are you? Please come home. I'm sorry, okay? Just call me. It cut off, and I sat there, the phone heavy in my hand. Sorry. She hadn't said a word when it mattered, hadn't even looked at me. Now she was sorry. I scrolled through the texts. Lorraine had sent a group message, one of those long ones meant to guilt everyone. Marcus ruined Thanksgiving with his little tantrum. Julia's a mess because of him. I snorted, the sound loud in the quiet room. Ruined it. I hadn't yelled, hadn't flipped a table, just walked out. If that ruined her night, maybe she should have thought about that before shoving me by the trash. I opened my email instead, fingers moving before my brain caught up. Divorce paperwork. I'd started it once, years ago, after a fight with Julia about her family. Never finished it, just saved the draft and let it sit. Now I pulled it up, the words staring back at me in black and white. I didn't type anything new, didn't hit send, just looked at it. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down hard. I set the phone on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, the ceiling cracked and yellowed above me. The silence spoke louder than Julia's tears, louder than Lorraine's venom. It told me what I'd known for a while. I couldn't keep doing this. Not with them, not with her. The heater clanked again, and I closed my eyes, trying to shut it all out. Sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept churning, replaying the night, the years, every time I'd smiled through their crap. When I woke up, gray light was creeping through the window, the room still cold. I checked my phone again, more calls, more texts, but I didn't read them. I blocked Julia's number first, then Lorraine's, then Monica's. One by one, until the screen was quiet. My finger hovered over the email draft again, the cursor blinking at me. I didn't send it, not yet. But I didn't delete it either. I got up, splashed water on my face from the sink, and looked in the cloudy mirror. My eyes were tired, lines deeper than I remembered. The silence stayed with me as I grabbed my jacket and headed out, the key clinking on the desk as I left. The truck started with a rumble, and I drove off, the inn shrinking behind me. I didn't know what came next, just knew I wasn't going back. The road hummed under the truck's tires as I drove away from the inn, the morning sky gray and heavy with clouds. I didn't want to go home, not yet, not with Julia there, not with the weight of last night still hanging on me. So I called Calvin, my old buddy from before all this mess with Julia's family started. He picked up on the second ring, his voice rough like he'd just woken up. Marcus? You good, man? I told him I needed a place to crash, no questions for now. He didn't push, just said, Come over. Doors open. That's why I liked Calvin. He didn't dig where he wasn't wanted. His place was a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy, just a porch with a sagging roof and a yard full of weeds. I pulled up around noon, the gravel driveway crunching as I parked. He was already outside, a beer in his hand, waving me in. "You look like hell," he said, grinning a little. I managed a half-smile. "Feel like it too." Inside, the house smelled like wood smoke and dog. His mutt, Rusty, bounded over, tail wagging, sniffing my jeans. Calvin tossed me a beer from the fridge, and we settled on the couch, the springs creaking under us. He didn't ask about Thanksgiving, didn't ask why I wasn't home. We just drank, the TV flickering with a football game neither of us cared about. It felt good, normal, like I could breathe again. Later, we fired up the grill out back, the smell of charcoal cutting through the damp air. Burgers sizzled on the rack, fat dripping into the flames, and Calvin flipped them with a spatula, talking about some job he'd picked up fixing cars. I nodded, sipping my beer, letting the words wash over me. Rusty ran circles around the yard, chasing nothing, his bark sharp in the quiet. For the first time in days, my shoulders loosened, the tightness in my chest easing up. I didn't think about Lorraine or that folding table, just stood there, the heat of the grill warming my hands. My phone stayed in my pocket, turned off since the inn. I didn't want to see Julia's name, didn't want to hear her voice cracking through a voicemail. But I couldn't ignore Zoe. She was the one piece of this I couldn't let go. So I pulled the phone out, turned it on, and sent Julia one text. "I need space. Don't contact me. I'll reach out when I'm ready." I hit send, watched the little checkmark pop up, and waited. No reply came. Good. Then a message from Zoe flashed on the screen. "Are you okay, Dad? Mom is being weird." My chest tightened again, but not like before. This was softer, sharper. I called her right then, stepping away from the grill, the phone pressed to my ear. She answered fast, her voice small but steady. "Dad?" "Hey, kiddo," I said, keeping it light. "I'm okay. How about you?" We talked for an hour, her sitting in her room at her friend's house, me leaning against Calvin's porch railing. I told her the truth, gently, not all of it. Said Grandma Lorraine had been mean, that I'd left the dinner, that Mom and I needed some time to figure things out. Zoe listened, quiet at first, then asked, "Did she put you at the little table again?" I paused, surprised. "Yeah. How'd you know?" "She did it last year too," she said, matter of fact. I didn't like it. I rubbed my face, the stubble scratching my hand. My kid had seen it more than I thought. I didn't like it either, I admitted. We talked more about her friend's dog, about school, about how she wanted to come home soon. I promised I'd see her, no matter what. When we hung up, I felt lighter, like a piece of me had clicked back into place. Calvin called me over, the burgers done, and we ate on the porch, Rusty begging for scraps. The meat was juicy, the bun soft, better than anything Lorraine had served up. The TV droned inside, the game still going, and Calvin cracked a joke about the quarterback's haircut. I laughed, real, not forced. My phone stayed quiet, no buzz, no flash. Julia hadn't texted back. Maybe she'd listened for once. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking, and watched the sky darken. Zoe's voice stuck with me, her quiet understanding cutting through the noise in my head. I wasn't just running, I was finding my way back to something. Calvin's place wasn't home, but it was close enough for now. The beer was cold, the food was warm, and I could breathe. That was enough. The day stretched out at Calvin's place, slow and easy, like the world was giving me room to think. I stayed there, sleeping on his lumpy couch, waking up to Rusty licking my face and the smell of coffee brewing. It wasn't home, but it was better than facing Julia or the echoes of that dinner. Calvin kept me busy, fixing his old lawnmower, chopping wood for the fireplace, anything to keep my hands moving so my mind wouldn't. We didn't talk about it much, just let the quiet settle between us. The TV stayed on, football games blending into each other, and I started to feel like myself again, piece by piece. One afternoon, Calvin came back from the grocery store, a bag of burgers and buns under his arm. He tossed them on the counter and said, "Ran into Trevor today." I looked up from the wood I was stacking by the fireplace, my hands still dusty. "Yeah." Calvin nodded, cracking open a beer. He looked rough. Said he should have said something that night. Kept going on about it, like it's eating him up. I set the log down, brushing my hands on my jeans. Trevor, Monica's husband, the guy who'd sat there cutting his turkey while Lorraine shoved me to the side. I pictured his face, tight and uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. He didn't, I said flat. Nobody did. Calvin shrugged. Guess he's feeling it now. I didn't say anything, just grabbed a beer from the fridge and popped the cap. The cold fizz hit my tongue as I thought about it. Trevor ashamed, finally seeing what a coward he'd been. It didn't fix anything, didn't erase the cold potatoes or the trash bin smell, but it shifted something. I took a long sip and leaned against the counter, the wood cool under my elbows. Later that night, Zoe called again. She was back home with Julia now, her voice crackling through the phone as she told me about her day, school, her friend's new bike, little things. Then she said, Mom and Aunt Monica aren't talking. Mom's mad at her, I think. I sat on the porch steps, Rusty sprawled beside me, his head on my knee. What happened? I asked, keeping my tone easy. Zoe paused, like she was picking her words. Aunt Monica said something about Thanksgiving, and Mom yelled at her. Grandma's mad too. Nobody's coming over anymore. I scratched Rusty's ears, the fur soft under my fingers, and let that sink in. Julia and Monica fighting, Lorraine losing her grip. It was like my walking out had cracked something open. I didn't smile, didn't laugh, just sat there feeling the weight of it. You okay there? I asked Zoe. Yeah, she said quick. Just weird. Are you coming home soon? I looked out at the dark yard, the trees swaying in the wind. Soon, kiddo. I promise. We hung up, and I stayed on the steps, the night pressing in. Calvin stepped out, his boots thumping on the wood. Everything good, he asked. Yeah, I said, nodding. Just stuff's moving. He didn't push, just sat beside me with his beer, the two of us quiet under the stars. The next day, I drove into town for some groceries, bread, eggs, a few things to pitch in. The cashier, an older lady with a loud laugh, recognized me from years back. Heard about that dinner, she said, bagging my stuff. Lorraine's been spinning tales, but folks aren't buying it. I raised an eyebrow, handing her cash. What are they saying? She grinned, showing a gap in her teeth. That you walked out like a king. People saw her true colors. Some of her friends even skipped her last coffee thing. I took the bags, my chest loosening a bit. Good to know, I said, and headed out. Back at Calvin's, I told him about it over burgers we grilled that night. He laughed, slapping the table. One quiet exit, and the whole damn house falls apart. That's some power, man. I chewed my burger, the meat smoky and warm, and thought about it. Lorraine's perfect little world, her daughters, her control, was splintering. Julia fighting with Monica, Trevor kicking himself, people pulling away. All because I'd stopped playing their game. It wasn't revenge, not really, just clarity, like a fog lifting. I didn't need to yell or fight. Walking out had done more than words ever could. The fire crackled inside, Rusty snoring by the hearth, and I finished my beer, the bottle cold against my lips. The ripple was spreading, and I didn't have to lift a finger. That felt better than I'd expected. Weeks had passed since that night at Lorraine's, and the air felt different now, crisper, freer, like I'd shed something heavy. I'd been staying with Calvin, but it was time to take a step forward, not just hide out. Zoe kept asking when I'd see her, and I couldn't keep putting it off. So I decided to do Thanksgiving my way, a redo. No folding tables, no cold food, just us. I invited Zoe and Calvin over to my place, the little house I hadn't stepped foot in since I'd left. Julia wouldn't be there. I'd made that clear in a short call a few days back. She'd cried, begged me to talk, but I kept it simple, not now. This is for Zoe. She didn't fight it, just went quiet, and I hung up. The house felt strange when I walked in, empty, the air stale, my boots echoing on the floor. Julia's stuff was still around, her coat on the rack, a mug in the sink, but I ignored it. This wasn't about her. I headed to the kitchen, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. Turkey was the plan. I'd never cooked one before, so I pulled up a YouTube video on my phone, some guy in an apron talking me through it. The bird was heavy, cold from the fridge, and I fumbled with the giblets, cursing under my breath as they slipped out of my hands. The oven preheat beeped, and I shoved the turkey in, hoping I'd seasoned it right, salt, pepper, a stick of butter I'd rubbed on like the guy said. Next came the sides, mashed potatoes, green beans, a pie I'd try not to burn. The kitchen smelled like chaos at first, smoke curling up when I forgot the pie crust too long. I yanked it out, black around the edges, and laughed at myself. Good enough, I muttered, scraping off the worst bits. Zoe showed up around 4, dropped off by her friend's mom since Julia wouldn't come near. She ran in, her backpack bouncing, and hugged me hard. Dad, it smells good in here, she said, her eyes bright. I hugged her back, her hair soft against my chin. Hope it tastes good too, I said, grinning. Calvin rolled in a few minutes later, Rusty trotting behind him, a six-pack under his arm. You didn't burn the place down, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Progress. We set the table, my table, the one in our dining nook, scratched and small but mine. Zoe made place cards with crayons, little folded papers with our names, Dad, Calvin, even Rusty. She giggled as she set them out, and I watched her, my chest warm. The turkey came out golden, not perfect but edible, and I carved it with a knife that wobbled in my hand. Potatoes were lumpy, beans a little overcooked, but it didn't matter. We sat down, the three of us plus Rusty begging under the table, and piled our plates high. The food was warm, messy, real, better than anything Lorraine could have dreamed up. Zoe took a bite of turkey and grinned. This is way better than Grandma's, she said, her mouth full. I laughed, the sound easy. Thanks, kiddo. Calvin nodded, chewing. Not bad for a first try. Beats cold spuds any day. We ate slow, talking about nothing big, Zoe's school project, Calvin's latest car fix, how Rusty stole a sock last week. The windows fogged up from the heat inside, the November chill locked out. My phone buzzed on the counter across the room. Julia, probably. I didn't get up. Didn't check it. This was my space, my rules, and she wasn't part of it tonight. Zoe looked at me after a while, her plate half empty, and said, "This feels more like family." Her voice was quiet, but it hit me hard. I nodded, my throat tight. It is, I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. She smiled, small and sure, and went back to her food. Calvin raised his beer, a toast without words, and I clinked my bottle against his. The pie came out next, crust a little burnt, filling runny, but Zoe clapped like it was a masterpiece. We ate it anyway, laughing when Rusty licked crumbs off the floor. The night stretched on, dishes piling in the sink, the house alive with noise, our noise. When Zoe yawned, I set her up on the couch with a blanket, Calvin crashing in the spare room with Rusty sprawled beside him. I cleaned up slow, the quiet settling back in, but it wasn't heavy this time. The phone buzzed again, Julia's name flashing. I let it ring out, washing the last plate. This was my table, my family, my rules. I didn't need her voice to tell me otherwise. I turned off the lights and sat by Zoe, her breathing soft. For the first time in weeks, I felt right where I belonged.